In today's video, we will be looking at my new Pinter 3 CO2 Recharger version 2.0. We'll start with an introduction explaining everything you need to know about the CO2 Recharger. Then we will move on to a step-by-step guide how to make the new style adapter using a used hopper bottle. And then finally, we will move on to the third part of the video, which will be covering how to use the CO2 Recharger with your Pinter 3 and the type of issues that it will enable you to resolve. The biggest difference between the V1 controller and the V2 controller is the adapter that is used to connect the device to recharge the CO2. The original V1 controller had the ball lock adapter, and you will see that screwing that into the hopper bottle was quite challenging to make really a safe connection because the ball lock adapter was really quite bulky, and when you drilled a hole in the end of the hopper bottle, you had to screw in the ball lock adapter from the outside of the hopper bottle into the inside of the bottle, and this meant that you couldn't get the nut on the back of the thread of the ball lock adapter to actually tighten it up. So the only alternative was to use a high strength adhesive to keep it in place. Whilst I've never had an issue with this and it's never actually fired off under pressure, that's not to say that it couldn't. And it certainly is, I would say, a safety concern long term that the adhesive could have become perished, it could become cracked under pressure, constant use over a longer duration. The day might come that that type of adapter just blows apart. So looking to resolve this issue, I had to come up with an idea for the V2 controller that would get us away from this situation. In doing so, I looked at alternative ideas in my mind, and the most obvious one that stood out to me was the Schrader valve, which you will no doubt recognize instantly from your tubeless car tires. Now, these Schrader valves are used for high pressure applications. They're used for all kinds of things like car tires, obviously, motorbikes, 4x4 vehicles, quad bikes, but they are used for applications outside of vehicle tires also. They're used for high pressure compressed air systems. They are used for hydraulic works. They are even used in some gas central heating boilers in the sort of like air expansion tank in the back, the air bladder, if you like. So it's a very versatile adapter. So in looking at the Schrader valve compared to the ball lock adapter, it's got two distinct advantages for adaptation with the hopper bottle. And that is, it is a lot more slender, so it's a more streamlined fit. But more importantly than that, when we drill the hole in the hopper bottle, the Schrader valve is inserted from the inside out, and the edge of the valve butts up tight against the shoulders of the hopper bottle, and we use the nut on the outside so we can get the nut on and mechanically tighten that up properly, and the washer that is on the Schrader valve creates an airtight seal, so no adhesives are used at all. So this being the case, it gives us a much more streamlined finish, and it's a much safer finish because under almost any pressure, there's absolutely no way that valve can pop out or fire off because it's fed from the inside out, and we can get the nut on the outer edge and do it up, so it's perfectly safe. So this seemed to me like a great experiment to try, and obviously this is the result of that experiment. Now, once we use the Schrader valve, you can see it in the back here, once we use this successfully on the adapter, then the type of CO2 recharger we use is much more versatile too. And I've opted here for this, which is simply the type that you would blow the tires up, on your bicycle, the CO2 injector that you would, cyclists use them to quickly inflate their tires. These are perfect now that we've got this Schrader valve into the hopper bottle, and it's a perfect, real neat and tidy solution to quickly recharge the Pinter 3. Now this type of device, just like the V1, they only use the 16-gram threaded CO2 cartridges, and so there's a limited capacity of how much pressure they can put in a vessel like that anyway. I find it's generally around 20 psi. So when you connect these devices and turn them on, even like full, open up the gas full, at 20 psi, they'll stop delivering gas because they can't compress anymore into the headspace of the pinter. And that's very convenient for us because it means we don't need dials. You don't need a pressure dial. You don't need to see that it's 20 psi. All we need to know is that we cannot overcharge the vessel. It's not really a high pressure thing. These little adapters, these little cartridges cannot overcharge the pinter fermentation vessel because they're not capable of doing it. So it's a great little device for us. It really is. Plug and play, pop it on, recharge, switch it off, put it off, which is ideal for the circumstances that we're looking in use with our Pinter 3. Using this type of device to inject CO2 into our pinter is simplicity itself. So this is going to be really the easy part of the journey, to be honest. You really just screw it onto the Schrader valve and turn the dial to release the gas, pressurize it, and flick the switch back off. So that is simplicity in itself. Of course, if there was a difficult part in this, the difficulty is making the adapter unit itself, which obviously previously with a V1 puts some people off trying. So what we'll do now is we'll take a quick look at a step-by-step guide how I made this adapter to see if it can reassure you guys that you have the capability to drill a hole in the hopper bottle and insert the Schrader valve and do the nut up. So let's have a quick look at the step-by-step guide how to do it. Okay, so here is the hopper bottle. You can see from the underside of the hopper bottle that there is actually a little imperfection there in the plastic, which is kind of an indicator of the center. So we're going to use a very small drill bit to drill a pilot hole into this, and then basically I'm going to turn it over and use the 11mm drill bit to drill from the inside out, which will be the final hole. So here we go. I'll look to find what looks to be the most central piece. Anywhere around there is probably going to do the trick. Take it nice and easy. Don't want the drill bit to bind into the plastic. Okay, so there's my pilot hole now. I'm going to turn this around the other way. Insert an 11mm drill bit. I'm going to use that to just pop it into the guide. That's it. Once you've got that in the guide, keep the drill bit straight as possible. Use a bit of waste wood so you can drill through cleanly on the other side. Just double checking here that the tip of that drill bit is going into the pilot hole. When you're happy that you're ready to drill the hole, See, that's coming out the other side now. Okay, so there's the hole. The clean edge is on the inside, which is why it's important that we drill from the inside out. And this edge here, I'll just get a sharp knife and I'll just clean that off. I'll just trim that, the worst of that off. I'll just go and give that a quick rinse out, give it a quick wash through to get any dust and bits out of it before we connect the valve to it. Might be worth just going around that with a little bit of sandpaper, just to smoothen it off slightly. The inside though looks nice and smooth, being as we were cutting through with the drill bit in that direction. So I've just given this a good rinse through now with water to wash away any loose bits of plastic, and I've put some paper towel in there just to give it a good dry. So that is it. Now that's as good as we're going to get. That's the hole now ready for the actual valve. So here is the Schrader valve. We don't really need that cap. I don't think I'll be replacing that because it's not like the dust cap in the sense that we'll be needing that in the way that a car tyre would, for example. So I think I'll be just using this valve as it is. Now you can see that this valve comes complete with a rubber washer here. The 11mm drill bit is to allow that first section of rubber to sink inside there like that. You can see it's a perfect fit. Of course, the great thing about this, what makes it so safe, is that we're going to be fitting it from the inside, which means that this cannot break free. Like this, the shoulders of this actual hopper cannot be broken here, so this is going to be as safe as it could possibly be, unlike when we used the ball lock adapter. You can see this rubber washer fits perfectly in that 11mm hole, so when we put the nut on this to tighten it up, it's going to make a perfect airtight seal. We don't need any adhesives, and it'll be perfectly safe for high pressure use. So literally just make sure that that's centered, make sure that the washer is in the gap, hold the valve and tighten this up. I'll just go and get a pair of pliers or a spanner just to do that up, give it an extra pinch.
I don't think we have to go crazy on this. I'm just going to hold that valve with my fingers. I'm just going to use an adjustable spanner here. What I'm trying to do here is use the table as leverage so that I can get a better grip on this valve and twist it to do the nut up. So I'm holding the valve and the hopper, twist it to do the nut up as tight as I can, like that. That should be plenty tight enough. And that's it. You can see now, hopefully inside there, it's a beautiful clean finish. That is perfectly safe now. It's absolutely impossible that that is going to be able to break the shoulders of this bottle and ever come away. So it's perfectly neat and tidy result. As I say, the dust cap here, what fell off earlier, I don't think that it's going to be necessary to be using these dust caps, to be honest, like you would on a car tyre. But if you want to just keep it clean and tidy when it's not in use, keep the dust or debris out of there. I mean, it's going to do no harm. It's totally up to you whether you leave the valve open or pop that on to keep it clean. But there you go. That is how you make the CO2 Recharger version 2.0. Let's get back to the kitchen.
So there you go. Hopefully you are in agreement with me that that process is really quite simple. Just, popping a little hole in a hopper bottle and dropping the valve in and bolting it up. It's really, it's within the scope, I think, the skill set of most people. There's one thing that I'd like to point out at this stage, and that is when you buy these Schrader valves, incidentally, they tend to come in packs of 2. That's what I bought. I think it was like £5, £5.50, but I'll talk more about the parts that you need later. But basically, they come in packs of 2, so you've got a spare valve there. And because we don't use an adhesive, if we ever get a fault with the valve, you can just unbolt it, drop it out, and fit a new valve. So that's fantastic. Great value for money. The thing that I'd like to point out is that these Schrader valves, if you're a keen cyclist or you've been into cycling in the past, you're probably going to know this already, but I should cover it anyway. And that is the Schrader valve has a removable core, and you use a little device, it's like a mini spanner, just a slotted device basically that fits inside the Schrader valve, and you can unscrew the core and you can actually remove the core of the valve. Now, if you've ever got a fault or a problem with air leaking out the core of the valve, you can actually replace just the core and not the whole valve if you wanted to. So, but the reason why I'm making this point is I do find that when you tend to buy these valves new, often the core has been screwed in, but often not screwed up fully. It's just screwed into the thread, but it's not screwed in tight. It's not screwed in all the way. They just put it in and then that's it. You've got the valve. Most people would put the valve on a tire or a wheel or whatever application they were using it for, and they would configure the valve, do it up, make sure it's happy and airtight and the like. So to make sure these valves are in a state of usability, you really need to be sure that the core inside the valve is done up properly. They don't need to be super tight, but of course they need to be screwed in all the way and just pinch tight. Now, to do this, the little tool that you need, I would recommend that you get one just to be sure. You might get the valves and find that the core is fully screwed in, but the tool that I will list the link for later on, and I'll tell you about more details of the shopping list of the bits that you'll require for this. It only cost me £2.50 anyway. You can see it's a small device there. It's very simplistic, but it's a real handy little tool. And I would suggest that for the sake of £2.50, you put this on your shopping list, and when you get your valves brand new, pop the tool in, make sure the core's done up, so you're going to get off to a good start, and you're not going to put the valve in and find straight away that the core is leaking air, before you've even done your first recharge. So now we will move on to how you actually use this device with your Pinter 3 and what issues it's going to help us resolve and why we should bother making one in the first place. First of all, I'm going to talk you through how to actually connect these 16-gram CO2 cartridges. This one is already screwed in. It's spent now, it's empty. So if you look at the cartridge, they get pierced as you screw them in. So this device, of course, you can see without the cartridge on it, there's really nothing to it. The actual injector itself, it actually says on there Pro Bike Tool, so obviously it's advertised to be suitable for inflating bike tyres. So basically the cartridge, you just begin to screw it in. Now there's going to be a little blast of like CO2 as you pierce the bottle. So when you get to the point where you feel that you're at the edge of the bottle and it's going to get pierced, screw it on as fast as you can. So I'll just hold this out. So that's it. As soon as the air blasts, keep going as fast as you can until it seals the CO2, and that's it. Now the bottle is connected and it is gas tight. Now the compression on CO2 is very high. You can actually get a lot of CO2 in a small cartridge like this because you can compress CO2 quite significantly. Whereas, for example, nitrogen, you wouldn't get anywhere near as much nitrogen in a bottle this size because you cannot compress it so much. So there's a lot of CO2 in these small bottles. They're really quite handy. This foam cover for the CO2 bottle is provided. That says Pro Bike Tool as well. This is the one that I've purchased. That's to cover the bottle because when you start to inject the CO2, these bottles almost like frost up. They can become super cold. So these are quite handy, that you can put this little foam attachment over the bottle so that if you have to handle it, you don't have to touch like a super cold bottle. So that's it really. Just screw the cartridge in as fast as you can, and then the O-ring inside just makes an airtight seal, gas tight seal, and that's it. Then it's ready to go. I should probably mention at this point that the CO2 that's required to use in brewing is food grade CO2. So basically, when you look for the 16-gram threaded cartridge, you must also be sure that it is food grade. Now, I find that the options are quite limited, to be honest. The company that I use, and you'll see the link in the description, and I'll give you the details in the shopping list at the end. I'm not affiliated with this company. The only reason I use them is because it's the cheapest I can find. So whether you buy from the link that I drop, I'll make nothing from that link if you click it or not. I think I pay these guys £12.50 for a box of 10, and that includes post and pack. It's £8 something plus post and pack, so it's basically £12.50 to your doorstep. Now there are alternatives. For example, I noticed that the malt miller sell boxes of 10 as well, food grade. They charge £12 for a box of 10, but unfortunately they charge £5.50 post and pack, which obviously to me is too expensive, £17.50. So it's as simple as that. I just go for the cheapest ones I can find that are food grade. The food grade, the actual standard grade, if you like. Some of the ones that are specifically made for like airsoft have sort of like a splattering of oil in it. I'm no expert in this, by the way. I'm just giving you an idea of the difference between food grade and not. The actual quality, I mean, a little statistic I've seen that the normal CO2 bottles are 99% pure CO2 and the food grade ones are 99.9%. Whether you can take that as gospel, I have no idea. It's just a little statistic that I read somewhere. Now, let's say, for example, you were to use a CO2 cartridge that was to inflate a bicycle air tyre. I'm not sure what contaminants might be in that to make it not suitable for food contact. But with the airsoft ones, which I'd mentioned earlier, there might be a splattering of oil in there specifically, so that as the CO2 passes through the airsoft rifle, it actually oils the internal mechanisms. And of course, that sort of contamination inside your brew, you wouldn't want a splattering of oil inside your beer. So it's not so much that, it's going to kill you, it's just that it's probably going to contaminate your beer if you don't use food grade CO2. So it's quite important that you get the right ones with this, and play it on the safe side. You don't want to waste your money and ruin your beer. So how do we use it and why would we use it? The two main issues that I'm going to cover first are your beer going flat halfway through, usually halfway through your brew. You'll find that the carbonation in your beer starts to reduce further and further and further, and then your beer starts to pour pretty flat, uncarbonated, and we were looking at that issue and how to recharge your pint of CO2 to resolve that problem. Now, of course, when you recharge in that circumstance, we'll take on this issue first. In that circumstance where the carbonation is running out of your beer, when you recharge the pinter, that carbonation is not instantly going to be replenished, because of course we will instantly replace the pressure in the headspace. But if you let the beer get too flat, then you're going to have to give it time back in your fridge for the CO2 to absorb into your beer and recarbonate in it. So my advice is, when you're actually working through your pinter and pouring your beer, as soon as you see that the carbonation level is starting to drop, then once you've had your couple of beers that day, recharge it straight away. Don't wait for the beer to be flat and then recharge it and then have to wait for the CO2 to absorb into the beer. As soon as you see that CO2 start to drive down to a level that you think this is on its way towards getting flat, then at the end of your drinking session that day, recharge it before you pop it back in the fridge. And then by the time you drink the next day, 24 hours later, the CO2 will have had time to absorb in it, and it will already now be invigorated again. Don't leave it too late until your beer's as flat as a pancake and then make a big job out of it. So how do we go about recharging it in this circumstance? Now, this issue usually occurs when you're probably halfway through your pinter. There's another issue I'm going to talk about later, only because a couple of people have asked me specific questions on this. But this main issue is, as you start pouring your pinter, the more you go through it, the more the pressure drops and the lower the carbonation in your beer. So you're usually halfway through your beer at this point. Now, in this pinter, for this demonstration, I have only got, this has not got beer in it, I've only got, I've half filled it with water. I put 2.5 litres of water in here. So basically, let's just imagine that this was beer, it's halfway down. Now, the first thing that you've got to ask yourself is, usually when this problem occurs, you half of your pint is empty. And the question you're asking yourself is the beer level below this port? Because if it isn't, now that it's in the horizontal position, of course, the headspace is in the top. Whereas, of course, when you were in fermentation and it was up right like this, the headspace was in the top here. So you were safe to put anything in there because liquid would not have come out. Now, in all pressure fermentation vessels, the air and the liquid valve, if you've got a separate one, which we have, of course, on the pinter, we've got a tap, so that's not relevant. But the actual air valve will always be on the top. So it will always be in the headspace. But of course, with the pinter, this is a hack. The pinter was not made to be recharged. They didn't design it that way. They didn't think this through in advance before they designed it. So when we turn it into the horizontal position, we have to be mindful how much beer is in there, because we need to know whether, when we actually insert the adapter, the hopper, whether the beer is going to flood the device, because we don't want the beer to flood the actual hopper and the actual air valve, because you can't pressurize this vehicle against the pressure of the water. It'd be bubbling and make a mess and everything. So we don't want to do that. We don't ever want to flood this adapter. So we have to be mindful and we have to think this through. So usually 9 out of 10 times the beer is going to be sufficiently used up before carbonation drops away and you start to see flat beer, that you can screw that straight in there and no beer is going to come out. If you have any doubt, if you've taken out maybe 2 or 3 pints and you think to yourself, you lift it up, you can feel the weight, you know how much is in there, and you think, well, I'm not sure. I don't know if the beer is at the valve or below the valve or not. I don't know if it's going to flood the adapter. The simple thing I do, and this is not very technical, but it's something that I always have on hand. I've always got this, and that is, I've always got a pair of shoes on. And I know it's not very technical, but I take a shoe off, I just gently lean the pinter forward, and I put the toe of my shoe underneath,
And that elevation just lets the beer sit like this. So that now, I know I'm saying, if I'm not sure, if I'm absolutely sure, if I've drank half of this away and I just know for a fact that it's below that valve and there's no chance of it flooding, then of course I'll just plug it in. But if I've got any doubt, then I'll literally just take my shoe off and screw the hopper in, screw the adapter in. So at that point, of course, you've got this, device ready to go now. It's ready to recharge. So once this is screwed in, I would say as well, before I attach this, there's something I want to point out, and that is when you elevate this and move your pinter around, always be quite gentle with the pinter, because any sediment that's settled, you don't want to be vigorously shaking it up. And that's another reason why I always recommend recharging for whatever purpose when you've finished drinking that evening. So if I'm going to have 2 or 3 glasses, because I have 2 or 3 glasses every day, I do. So let's say I'm going to have 2 or 3 glasses of beer out of my pinter. I will always make sure that I've finished my night's drinking before I recharge. I'll recharge it before I put it back in the fridge, because in that instance, this sediment that I've now lifted up here, and the sediment will have slightly mixed in with the beer, it will have 24 hours to settle again in the fridge before I actually start drinking again tomorrow. So it's always better to do this at the end of your drinking session, not at the beginning. And that's why I always look ahead, that if you think the carbonation is running out, get it at the end of your session, get it sorted at the end of the session. So anyway, it's as simple as this. Once you've got your adapter screwed in, you'll just screw that on all the way until it opens the valve. That's it. Just screw it up as tight as you can, finger tight. This still spins around, so this is very convenient, because that adapter, once that locks on there, that's perfectly normal for this to still move. And then when you want to put the CO2 in, you obviously use this lever to open the valve. Now, what I tend to do is just open the valve slowly. Whether it makes any difference, I really don't know. Half of this vessel now is going to be empty. And of course, there's no carbonation in this at all, because it's just water. Whereas usually you're going to have a head start. There's going to be some carbonation left, and the beer will have already been carbonated, so it will still have CO2 in the beer. But for this example, of course, I don't want to be messing about with beer, so we're going to have to make do with water. So this will probably take quite a lot of gas to fill this space in, because it's empty. So here you go. Basically what I'm going to do is just open the lever. It'll probably take literally 1 to 3 seconds. What I want you to listen for is when you hear the gas rush out, it'll fill the vessel, and you'll hear it. Hopefully you'll hear it on the camera still. Hopefully you'll hear it from the microphone still. When you hear the gas, actually the CO2 will force its way into the device, and then the pressure will die off. You'll hear it sort of back off. And at that point, it's hit its maximum capacity, if you like. So really, this is going to be done, within seconds. I'll just turn the lever. I'll give it 1 or 2 seconds, and then I'll turn the lever off, and that's done. So let's have a look and see. So you can hear now that the airflow's stopped. You can still hear a little bit of final pressurization, if you like, and that's it, it's done. So I can turn the CO2 now back off. You can see where this has gone cold. You can see that's got a cold tip. You can see this is chilled off. You see it's got a mist of cold on it. So at this point, that's it. That is now totally charged. So I can undo this. Of course, the Schrader valve instantly closes itself off, as you would expect, and then quickly undo your hopper or your adapter, should I call it. And that is it. That now has been recharged. Now, there's one thing I should point out at this stage. I'll just take my shoe back. Just take my shoe back so that the floor's not cold. There's one thing I should point out at this stage, and this is because somebody asked me this, that they made the mistake, and this was with the V1 controller, and it's not something I'd thought of explaining, to be honest, but because they brought it to my attention, what they done with the V1 controller is they recharged the pinter, and then when they took this off, they actually unscrewed the actual gas cartridge, the CO2 cartridge. So of course, what I want to point out here is that
just because the gas flow stops then, that's because it's reached its maximum pressure that this can deliver. It doesn't mean that the bottle's empty. So when you turn that back off, there's still CO2 in that bottle. You know, don't unscrew that bottle. Don't unscrew the bottle until it's empty. And you'll know it's empty by eventually when you try to recharge and you'll hear no gas comes out. Or you can even test the gas just by quickly, giving it a little blast. So don't make the assumption that because the CO2 has stopped flowing into the Pinter 3, that this gas bottle is empty, because that's not the case at all. It's just reached its compressed state, So that is now ready to put aside and use for the next recharge, until you're absolutely sure that that bottle has run out. So that's how to use the device to recharge your Pinter, and that's how to alleviate the actual diminishing carbonation of your beer. So now we'll move on to the next issue of the main two, and that is your actual beer cannot pour. The tap runs out of pressure. See, in this instance, the beer is likely still carbonated, but it's run out of pressure in the headspace, so you're unable to pour the beer. There are two examples of situations that might cause you to be unable to pour your beer from your Pinter 3. The first one is if you get maybe half a dozen friends around and you try pulling multiple pints out of your Pinter in quick succession. So if you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pints back to back, what will happen is the actual pressure in the headspace will reduce so much that in the end the tap will just trickle. To be honest, you wouldn't even get 5 pints out, I don't think, before the tap stopped pouring. So in that instance, the resolution to that is identical to recharging your Pinter for the CO2. You're recharging it for a different reason now, though. You're recharging it with CO2 because you want to increase the pressure in the headspace, not so much because you want to increase or revigorate the carbonation in your beer. So the simple way to do that is, if you've got your friends around, you've poured 3 pints back to back and it stops pouring, then of course you know what you have to do, and that is follow the exact structure and advice that I've just given for recarbonating your CO2. And that is, if you've only got 3 pints out of here, you can be rest assured that the beer level is going to be above your hop port. So you'll know that the chance of flooding the valve would be very high. So with this, you again will have to put something in here and gently elevate it to the point where the beer is far enough away from this. If you've only got 3 pints out there, so you know that it's going to be really quite high, then you might have to elevate it slightly higher. Put a shoe under there, but push your shoe in further, or wedge something else underneath there, but elevate it sufficiently so that the beer is not going to flow out and flood the adapter. And then you just repeat basically what we've just been through. Insert your adapter, recharge the vessel, and then lower it down as gently as what you can, and it will instantly now begin to pour again, and you'll be able to pour your beer. Of course, be mindful of the movement in this instance, because in this particular case, you're going to want to be pouring your beer straight away. So all you really need to do is be, gentle, that's all. So the sediment, you don't want to be knocking it around, you don't want to be carelessly knocking the Pinter around. Get your shoe or get a wedge or whatever you find suitable, and gently raise the Pinter to minimize the amount of disruption to the sediment, recharge it, and then gently put it back down, and then put it round, of course, into the pouring position, and you'll be able to carry on pouring then. Now, of course, let's say you're going to empty this vessel, you and your friends were going to clear it all in one go. Once you've got another few pints out, another 2 or 3, and it's half empty, if you wanted to, then you could connect this recharger and just switch it on and leave it on. You won't need to elevate the back anymore, because there won't be sufficient beer in there that's going to flood the adapter. And so therefore you could just plug it in, connect this, leave it switched on to permanently continue to pressurize the vessel and literally drain every pint out, 10 pints back to back, and in the end it'll just be blowing air, just be blowing CO2, sorry. So make sure then that you switch the device off, detach it, and your pint is done. So you could clear it in one session, using that technique if you're required to. Now, the second event that can cause this is a kind of a similar thing, but it's not because you've been pouring in quick succession. The second eventuality is not because you've had your friends round and you've poured so many pints back to back. It's just because over time, gradually, the pressure in the headspace, for whatever reason, is reduced just too much, and you're getting a real bad pour out of the tap. At this point, of course, this device, you can just connect it in the same way as we described and recharge this. And just like I've just described with, if you were offloading your pints to your friends, it will immediately recharge the pressure in the headspace and allow you to continue pouring the tap. So these two big issues, although you're recharging it for different purposes, one is for pressure, one is for carbonating your beer, the recharge method is the same. The technique is the same. Just be mindful. That's all you need to remember. Be mindful of how much beer you've got in the vessel, and just decide whether it needs to be elevated or not before you connect the adapter and recharge it with the CO2. Really, it's as simple as that. Now, they're the main two issues, and they are the most common issues. You're going to get this and experience it yourself, or you'll certainly know somebody that's experienced this time and time and time again. Primarily, them two issues alone is why this device was created. It was to resolve them two issues, because them two issues are substantial. I mean, you could even say catastrophic, because if you get halfway through your pinter and your beer's gone flat, then the remaining, 5 pints is wasted. To me, that is a catastrophe. That is catastrophic. Likewise, if you get halfway through your pinter and you can't pour it anymore, I've already explained the risks of opening up this valve and using gravity to pour it. You can oxidize your beer, and on top of that, you won't even be able to pour all your beer using gravity anyway. So, it's a dangerous game opening that valve. That valve should be on number 5 throughout the whole fermentation process, throughout the whole conditioning process, and throughout the whole tapping process and drinking. That valve, once you put that on number 5 at the very beginning, it shouldn't be touched again in an ideal world, unless you really have to. So that's the two main issues covered. One other issue that I do want to pick up on, and this is because I've mentioned this before myself, and that is having a foamy pour. Now, for the most part, when you, if you like, ferment on number 5, you go for the fermentation, the conditioning on number 5. If you're getting a foamy pour that's manageable, of course, don't forget, putting it in a really cold fridge, not freezing, but really cold, is paramount to reducing that foamy pour. So number 1, that's the first thing you need to check, the temperature of your fridge. Ideally it'll be around 2 or 3 degrees C. You don't really want it much higher. You don't really want much higher than that. I would say to a maximum of 5 degrees C. I have had my fridge at around 4 or 5 degrees C before, and I seem to have got away with that fine. It seems to have done the job. But above 5 plus, I'd say that's problematic, because that cold temperature is paramount to the CO2 being absorbed into your beer and carbonating it in the first place. And if you do not get the carbonation into your beer, then the pressure in the headspace is much higher, and that problem with the foamy pour will be elevated substantially. So that's the first thing. You really need to make sure that your fridge is at a sufficient temperature to really cool your beer properly and get that transfer of CO2 into your beer. Once that's covered, if you find yourself having a particularly bad pour where it's just so foamy you can't control it, most foamy pours, it's a little bit sort of like overcarbonated, the pressure's too high in the vessel initially, most of them you can get away with just trickling the tap, put the tap on a very, very slight trickle, and you can get away with it's manageable. And once you've got the first couple of pints out and you've got an equilibrium with the pressure, then it tends to get better and better. So if you can fight through that and tolerate it, then you've not really got an issue with foamy pour per se. But some beers in particular, I've mentioned this in the past, like the wheat beers, like Golden Grove is one of them, and there are other wheat beers that Pinter have done, and no doubt others. At times, for whatever reason, you might hit a foamy pour that is literally just unmanageable. You're pouring a glass of foam, and you just, no matter how you put the tap as low as you can, as low pressure as you can, and you just ended up with a pint of foam, and it's barely even drinkable. So you're frustrated, you don't know what to do. If the foamy pour is that bad, this issue now can be resolved because it's safe now to let some of that pressure out and vent some of that gas to reduce the foamy pour, only because we know that we can put the CO2 back in when we need to. So in that instance, if you wanted to alleviate that foamy pour somewhat, then you really want to flash this valve to the off position and then back on to reduce the pressure. Because the pressure at this point, if you put it in your fridge at the right temperature and the beer is fully carbonated and the pour is just impossible, then you're going to need to take some pressure out the headspace to make it manageable. So to do that, if you just quickly vent this, I'll give you a quick example. There you go. Put it to off, let some of the gas vent out, reduce the pressure, and then try your pour again. See how much the foam is reduced. If it's not sufficient, blast it again and vent it off. You might have to vent it off multiple times until you get the pour that you're looking for. The pour is now become manageable. So once you've vented sufficient gas, your pour has become manageable, you'll be able to now carry on and drink your beer and enjoy it, knowing that if you start to see signs of low carbonation, then at that point you can immediately recharge your pinter with the CO2 recharging device. So they are the main three issues there. This resolves the foamy pour, it resolves flat beer, it resolves not being able to pour at the tap. So that is the completion of that. I just want to bring in two other issues which are actually part of the same thing, but I've been asked this from multiple people actually, and that is they have said, look, we've gone through the brewing process, we've gone through the conditioning process. Immediately when we pour the beer, it's flat, straight from the off. So now here's my advice for that. The first thing that I would ask myself if I had flat beer from the very first pour is, did the actual fermentation process go successfully? Did the yeast activate? Did it even ferment your beer? Because of course, when the yeast ferments the sugars in the beer, the fermentable sugars, it produces CO2. Did that happen? Because if yeast didn't ferment your beer, then your beer is ruined anyway. For whatever reason, it didn't happen, it didn't work. There's been a fundamental error in the actual brewing process. And if that's the case, this recharge is not going to solve that problem. It's not going to solve that problem. So you need to ask yourself the first question: did the beer even go through successful fermentation and produce CO2 at all? If it didn't, unfortunately, then it's a write-off. Now, if it did, the way you'll know this is always be mindful when you do anything with your pinter. Always think about what you're doing, so you've got it as a reference point if something goes wrong. So the first question might be, if you tap your pinter and straight away the beer's flat, was it carbonated when you took it off the dock? That's an important question, because if you took the pinter from the dock and it was volcano, fully carbonated, then you know that fermentation was successful. It took place. The yeast activated, the fermentation process was good. So the question is then, the next question is, what happened between successful fermentation and your flat beer at the end of conditioning? Where did the CO2 go? Somewhere in your pinter, it's not held the pressure. It's let the CO2 out and the beer's gone flat. And resolving that issue, that's the problem you've got. You know, recharging this, if your pinter's not holding pressure and it's letting CO2 out, so the beer's not carbonating, then recharging it is not going to help that. You're just going to waste CO2 gas because the pinter is going to let that CO2 out just like it did the CO2 that was originally in there. Now, I'll just give you a little sort of like clue as maybe what to look for, and that is if you did you apply a hopper? Did the brew that you have put through include a hopper bottle? Because if you did, then the red flag would be that your hopping port has had like a micro leak. Now, these don't need to leak substantially at all to slowly let the gas out, you know, to slowly let the CO2 out. So the question might be, if you had a fully carbonated beer when you took the dock off and it was as flat as a pancake when you pour your first pour, if you applied a hopper bottle, is it possible that when you took that hopper bottle out, unscrewed it, the seal on the hopping port didn't seal correctly? And it really can be a micro leak. I mean, in fact, in the future, I've got another video coming about applying hoppers and how to look out for these micro leaks and protect yourself from this very problem. So, you know, to these guys that are asking me, I've got flat beers from the off, 10 pints of flat beer, you know, ask yourself, you've got to go through them methodical steps and ask yourself them questions that I've just raised. You know, did the fermentation take place successfully? Was it carbonated when you actually took the docking station off? And was it this type of beer pack that used a hopper? Because if it did, I would say that is probably the highlight of the problem, or certainly the first thing I would investigate. Now, if you found that the hopper had leaked, it had a micro leak, but you've identified that now and you've resealed the hopper valve by whatever means, then yes, at that point, if you've identified the issue and resolved it, yes, you can save your beer now, because at this point, of course, the pint is full. It's going to have a full 10 pints in it, and you are going to be safe to tip it upright like this and just reinsert your adapter and fully charge the pinter with your device. Obviously, if you put it in this position, all the sediment's going to be mixed up, but at this point, your beer's not ready to drink anyway. It's as flat as a pancake. It needs carbonation, you know, from scratch. So it's going to take time. It's going to take a couple of days for this to recarbonate now. If you recharge this vessel and the beer, 10 pints of this beer inside is totally flat, it's probably going to take 2 or 3 days to get properly carbonated again back in the fridge. And what I would probably have a tendency to do, if you've got 10 pints of flat beer, so there's no carbonation left in the beer or the headspace, I would recharge it with this device in this, you know, upright, this vertical position. Then I would put it back in the fridge, give it a couple of days, maybe even 2 or 3 days, and then I would probably bring it back out and recharge it again, because of course the first recharge, the CO2 will now have absorbed into the beer and left a insignificant amount of pressure in the headspace. So I would do a second recharge, and then I would put it back in the fridge for 24 hours. And then I think you'll find over the span of maybe 3 or 4 days, 2 recharges, the beer will come out fully carbonated. And then just look out for the usual issues of if the tap stops pouring, or if you see another reduction in the carbonation, then get straight on it and recharge it again. So there you have it. There is pretty much the whole details on the new CO2 Recharger version 2.0. I will just take this moment to go through the shopping list then of everything that I've spoken about in this video. I will also add links to everything that I refer to on this shopping list in the description of the video. So if you want to click them links and buy exactly the same as what I've purchased here, then you can do so. So to go through this methodically, the first thing you will need, of course, is the empty hopper bottle. So you will need to have a beer pack from Pinter that includes a hopper, and you'll need to keep that hopper back, give it a good old wash and clean, peel the label off so that you're ready to make the adapter. The second thing that you will need to purchase is the Schrader valve that actually is going to be attached to the hopper bottle to create the new style adapter. The third thing that you will need to purchase is the little core removal tool, just to make sure that when you get the device and get the valve attached to the hopper bottle, that you can just double check that the core inside has been sufficiently done up from the manufacturer to make it airtight. The next thing on your shopping list will of course be the device itself, the actual CO2 injector. This is one that I chose from Amazon just on the basis that it had, you know, many thousands and thousands of reviews, all of which were positive. So that was literally why I selected this one in particular, for no other reason than that. But I would suggest that these Schrader valves, there's no doubt lots of devices out there similar to this, you know, bicycle tire inflator that will work with this valve. If you see something else alternative that you like the look of, you know, that's fine, give it a go, it's probably going to work. If you want to buy the exact same as what I've purchased here, again, this will be in the links. And the final thing that of course you will need to buy is a box of food grade CO2, and I'll put you the links to the company that I use for these. As I mentioned earlier, the only basis of why I buy these and from that company is because they are the cheapest I can find. If you can find cheaper, then please do let me know, because I do not like wasting money. And if you can find cheaper than £12.50 delivered to your door, then let me know and I will be purchasing from the same place as you from now on. So that is it for the completion of the shopping list. And that is it for the conclusion of today's video. You know, it's been a good one. It's an interesting topic. I don't think there's going to be a design simpler than this. So if you have any interest in recharging your Pinter 3 with CO2, I think this is going to be probably the simplest approach, the simplest technique that you're going to get. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you on the next one. Cheers.